Thank you, my fellow Rotarians. We are recording this. Today's speaker is originally from the flatlands of the Prairie. Tanya Hanson has made the Lakes area her home, though, for the past 7 years. Tanya has worked and volunteered in hospice for over 15 years, and today she'll be talking about serving as a death doula and how conversations about death and dying are important and how we can approach them in a tender way. I know in addition, Tanya would like to share her screen, and I think that is available to all of our speakers. Looks like yes. Great, thank you kindly, and welcome, Tanya.
All right, thank you so much, Quinn. So the last time I saw my grandfather at his home, he was tired, his skin was gray, and he spoke really softly. And I didn't know how close he was to death. The next time I saw him a few days later, it was to say goodbye. He was in the hospital. And as I walked into his room, there was a curtain that was shielding his eyes from that fluorescent hallway light. His bed was pushed against the wall in the corner. And I don't remember what I said to him, but I do remember that I couldn't understand what he said to me. And I asked him again, and I really didn't hear what he had to say. He was so weak, and it was really difficult. I went out into the hall, and I was really upset. I was a young woman of 25 who felt shame for a lot of years because this death, dying, and funeral of my grandpa's was shrouded in lack of understanding, poor communication, and just overall disappointment. So that is my personal connection and interest in death and dying, that difficult death of my grandfather's. So this has morphed into beginning a hospice massage therapy program for a local hospice 15 years ago. And I have continued into the realm of being a death doula. So death doula, death midwife, death guide, these terms have become more popular lately. And because there is this movement to return the conversation and experiences of death and dying back into being a part of life. Death workers are not new. We have tended to our dying. We have taken care of our dead. We have done this for centuries. And then there was a shift to outsource the death and dying of our society. Now, one of those reasons was the Civil War. Families wanted their loved ones to be able to come home, and embalming was a practice that had been happening throughout centuries. It just wasn't a common practice, and it began to become more common so that families could have their loved ones from the battlefield take the train home, however long that might be. And then we had hospitals, and the medical system took care of the care of the dying. And then we had funeral homes shield us from all of the aspects of after-death care. So here's an unpopular truth. We all die. Now, it is common to imagine that other people die. We segment in our brains that, of course, we know we all die. However, there's always this little bit in our brains that doesn't quite connect that we will be the ones ourselves dying. So because of the difficulties we have on a whole to talk about anything and everything remotely associated with death, death doulas have emerged. We have stepped into families and facilities and hospitals and businesses. So I am going to share my screen right here. I thought I was going to share my screen. That's the way it always goes. I had it set up beforehand. Let me just do this. Goodness sakes. Well, we'll just skip that for now. That's the way it goes. Death doulas are non-medical, holistic support and comfort. So death doulas are non-medical. These are the important parts of this. They're non-medical and they're holistic. And the comfort is for the dying person, the family, and the caregivers. And this can be education. This might be guidance. It might be emotional, spiritual, or even practical care. So that's the crux of what a death doula is. Now, I encourage you, if you meet a death doula, you find out that somebody you know is a death doula, ask them what their specific interest is in the field, because we have a lot to offer. And death doulas sometimes do a little bit of everything. Some death doulas will focus in on specific areas. So for example, pre-planning, perhaps there'll be a death doulas can help with advanced care directives, choosing a healthcare advocate, the organization of just what it looks like to be ready to go into that final stage of life. And that organization might be personal effects. It might be something that looks like care, organizing care, that organization part. There's also legacy, which, oh my goodness, these people who do legacy work for death doulas, or death doulas who do legacy work, I should say, they might do something with art or a quilt or letters or a video or recipes. There's so many creative outlets that somebody could be helped with to just allow that legacy of their life to continue. Some death doulas do actual caregiving of the person, not probably exclusively, because that's not probably what's going to happen, but maybe as a part of a team. Maybe in the future, there will be community care doulas, which I really hope to be a part of someday in this area, where there are multiple death doulas together and in the community care can be given to people who maybe don't have anybody to be with them at the end of life. Some death doulas will do vigil sitting, which would be sitting by the bedside of a person who is actively dying, being with the family while that person is dying. It could be after death care. So instructing the family, if the family wants to wash and care for the body at home, letting them know what they can do and how to do that in a lovely ritualistic way. There are also home funeral guides. There are organization pieces that need to take place, especially in Minnesota, for the rules to have a home funeral, which is absolutely possible. And some death doulas provide that as well as bereavement and grief ongoing support. I have learned of a couple new things for myself that I didn't know were out there. One is threshold singers. I'm fascinated with this, but there's a choir, like a few people get together and they will go to somebody's home or facility. And when somebody is very close to the end of life, they will sing for them in this space. And I just find, I have goosebumps whenever I think about that. I just think what a lovely space that is. There are also death care pet doulas. So if you are super connected to your pet and you know your pet is at the end of life, there are doulas who have that service of being able to support you through that as well. Some doulas are also celebrants, so they can help with the funeral or the memorial. And then there's also education. And this might be community education, or it might be patient family education. So I know that was a lot of information, and I was hoping to kind of give you a little clip of that on the screen, but you know, it's planning an organization, legacy, caregiving, that kind of care at the end of life, either sitting with vigil or even helping with bereavement and grief. These are all lovely aspects that death doulas take care of. So currently I am a hospice massage therapist. I have been a hospice volunteer, both a friendly volunteer and a vigil volunteer. And a friendly volunteer is somebody who goes and visits and might do some errands. And a vigil volunteer is somebody who sits bedside as somebody who is actively dying. And as a death doula right now, what I'm focusing on is education. So that means talking to groups like you. That means also speaking to families when I'm working in my hospice realm. I've taught classes online. I am excited to be presenting 2 sessions at this year's Back to Basics, hosted by Happy Dancing Turtle. One of those will be on green burials and alternative rituals. That will be one session. And then another session will be Ask a Death Doula session. So we'll see if anybody shows up. Death isn't always very popular, so I'm not going to take it personally. One of the other things I do is I talk to families about what the end of life process might look like for their loved ones. Because if you do not see death regularly, you don't have an experience of what it might look like. And you may have experienced a death, and not all deaths look the same. And if you don't know what to expect, sometimes it can feel really traumatic. Like for me, I was 25 and I was in the hospital and my grandfather was there. And even though he was cared for well and he was medicated and wasn't in pain, it was quite difficult for me. And so my hope is that with education of all sorts with dying and death, that we can make this less traumatic for people, less difficult, even though it is so very difficult to have our loved ones die. You know, sometimes I wonder, is it easier for the person who is dying than those of us who are left behind to witness all of it? Sometimes it definitely feels that way. So, for example, I was with a family a few months ago. The husband and wife had been married over 70 years. The family had been taking care of the mother. And when I got to their home that particular Tuesday, there was definite signs and changes that death was going to be closer. And I had been with this family for quite a while, seeing them weekly. And so I was able to be very frank with them and yet tender, knowing it's really difficult because even though a death is expected, it still feels unexpected when it happens, even though we know it's coming, even though somebody might be on hospice. It just still is the finality of what it is. And so I took my time to talk to that husband, to let him know that the things that were happening, the things he was seeing, you know, for example, she was pulling at her clothing. She wasn't very comfortable, it didn't seem. She was reaching out, it seemed as if, to something else. Those symptom signs, you know, sometimes can be at the very end of life, and sometimes it can be before the end of life. So knowing that this woman had these signs and the way her breathing was, I was able to just tell this family, you know, this is how things might change. So specifically, at the end of life, our breath changes. And this is typically, I'll just caveat that with some diseases don't follow this trajectory, but many do when we're at the end of life. So specifically, when we're at the end of life, our breathing changes. There will be periods of time when we actually don't breathe. This is called apnea. And that might be for 10 seconds, it might be for 15 seconds. And then there typically is a kind of a bigger inhale, might even sound like a gasp, but a larger inhale, and then maybe some faster breaths. And again, we have a longer period of time. So even talking about it, maybe you feel yourself getting all stressed. Take a breath. And I tell my families, I tell my people all of the time, when you're sitting bedside, when you're paying attention to somebody at the end of life, you need to remember to breathe yourself, because we get caught up in what we're around. And so that apnea gets longer. It might go 45 seconds. It might be a minute, 3 minutes. Once we get to 5 minutes, the last breath has been taken. So you can see where, if you were in the space of being by your loved one, where that information might be really helpful, because how would you know? How would you know how long to sit and wait for that last breath? So that's why I feel information is so important, this education. And that's just one aspect of the end of life. And death is not a medical event. And I think that education can really help decrease that trauma of the experience, like I said before. And again, death is, even when it's expected, it's still unexpected. And I think we can minimize the trauma over death and dying with some tender conversations. To have tender conversations around death and dying is really vulnerable. It can typically be emotionally charged. And it's a space to acknowledge, right, that time is limited, and this particular time in life can be really difficult. So I used to call these conversations difficult, and it is true. Speaking of death and dying can be difficult. And when we shift to a space of tenderness, though, I feel like we have more room to hold all the feelings and all the thoughts that come up with that. So I have a few beliefs around guiding people in tender conversations around deaths, and there's a few of them. They're not limited to, but one, no one can die wrong. You're not going to do it wrong. The dying process is what it is. And while I might not choose what's happening, that's okay. I might choose something different at my death, and that's okay. People can do that. So the key points, some more conversations around death. The more you do these conversations, the easier it gets. And once is not normally enough, unless death is imminent and you have no more time, right? Then we only do what we can do. And the reason that I think it's really important that we have more conversations about this is because as time goes on, our choices change, our understandings of things change, our beliefs might change. So to have these conversations ongoing is really, really important, in my opinion. So let me give you a few ideas on how to maybe start a tender conversation with your family, a loved one, a partner. And this can be anything death and dying related. Maybe you want to start with, do you know where you want to be buried? Or do you want to be cremated? A question you might ask is, do you have a health directive? Those are a few options. And if somebody does have a health directive, make sure you tell somebody about it, because it doesn't do any good if nobody knows about it and you've filled it out and it's in your file. Somebody's going to find it after the fact and they'll say, well, we did the best we could. Another thing you can do to start a conversation is to say, oh, I heard a speaker today talk about death and dying. You can bring it up. Lots of times there's something on the news you can correlate it to, or when you're reminiscing about a loved one that has died, you can ask a question regarding something about death and dying as too. So there's some subtle ways you can bring up a conversation besides, my favorite is, you want to talk about death and dying? I don't normally do that to people, but I could talk about it all the time, because it's so much a part of life in my viewpoint. So our goal is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. But first, let's just take a second right now to move into a more relaxed space. So go ahead, soften your gaze. You can look down. You can even close your eyes for a moment. I want you to relax your jaw. Let your shoulders soften. Feel your seat on the chair, your feet on the floor. Go ahead and take a breath in and feel the breath go out. One more breath. And then go ahead and bring your attention back to the screen, right? Just a quick little breath here. So this is your baseline of comfort, right? We're going to start at this baseline. So when you start to feel uncomfortable, you can come back to this baseline. You can connect with your feet. You can take a breath. My encouragement is to not stop and bolt, but to pause and rest. I think that's good advice for many, many things, but especially when we're having these tender conversations. So let's just talk about DNRs, not the Department of Natural Resources, but do not resuscitate. So do not resuscitate is a medical order. It's written by a doctor that CPR will not be used if a patient stops breathing or the heart stops beating. That's what a DNR is. Now, this is not a decision made and never reviewed or discussed. Well, actually it is. All the time, somebody makes a decision, but ideally we want to be paying attention to how old are we? What are our health circumstances? Has our health changed? So this idea of a DNR should and can be revisited to, have a DNR or to not have a DNR. Can I see a quick hands? Does anybody have a DNR right now? So there are a couple of people who have DNRs. Okay. So a lot of us kind of go into this like catastrophic accident. We don't want to be a vegetable. We don't want to be in a hospital for years. We think, just let me go. And that is valid and not the only likelihood that a DNR will or will not be followed. So in our society, we have been taught to call 911 for any emergency. So if you collapse on the sidewalk downtown, someone will likely call 911 and CPR will be performed. Even if you have a DNR, even if someone with you says they don't want CPR, the paramedics are going to do CPR and then they're going to let the hospital sort out the rest. And when we hear about CPR, we see it in the movies and on television. How many have been trained in CPR? Anybody here trained in CPR? A couple people trained. Okay. How many people have performed CPR? Yeah, I'm there with you guys. Eaton, Robert, that's something to do, I'll tell you. You're trained for it and then you do it. And whew, at least as a layperson. If you are medical providers, well, then that's probably something you do a lot. But I know as a layperson, once was enough. So CPR is something that's, important. It's important for us to be able to try to do something helpful. What they don't show on TV is that ribs are broken if you've done CPR well, because you need that intense pressure to circulate the blood. Now, if you're a young football athlete playing for the NFL, well, you know what? CPR probably works pretty well and you recuperate pretty well and you're on TV, within a month. But if you're older, if you have COPD, if you have cancer, if you're on hospice, this is when the question of a DNR needs to be thought through intentionally, because CPR doesn't fix us. CPR isn't going to fix the cancer, but it will break your ribs. And so again, right, this tender space of conversation. My father-in-law was getting cancer treatments for lung cancer, and he ended up in the hospital on a ventilator. He coded, meaning they did CPR on him, got a heartbeat back for a few seconds before he coded again, and then they did CPR again. And then my mother-in-law did finally say stop. What we didn't do, the tender conversation we didn't have was that DNR conversation with him. Had we had that conversation multiple times before this point, we could have we could have changed that. It wouldn't have been so traumatic. We could have lessened the trauma for my mother-in-law, for our whole family, for my father-in-law, and even the staff. Because the comment was made, we really didn't like to do that on Mike. You know, they knew he was in a space where this really wasn't going to be helpful. And I just had a tender conversation with my mom too, asking her some questions about her husband. A little background, he's ill health. He's had a heart transplant. He's 82. I'm like, Mom, what are you gonna do if Gary collapses here in the house? If you call 911, they're gonna do CPR. Is that what he wants? So we talked about having a DNR order. We talked about the options if something happened when she was at home. And we had to let that tender conversation simmer a bit. And then I came back to it a few weeks later just to check in to see how was it sitting. And it was hard. It was hard. And these tender conversations are so important for us to start with those people that we care. When we care about them, we want to talk about this. And they're meant to happen more than once. And they are powerful. So I want to encourage you not to be afraid to start your own tender conversations around death and dying. And with that, thank you, Quinn, for this invitation to speak about being a death doula and tender conversations. And thank you all for letting me share.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. Are there questions? I know we have a few minutes, so if folks have something to ask Tanya, she is here as a resource.
I'm not so sure it's so much a question, but an affirmation. As a parish pastor, I had a funeral yesterday, and I just picked up another funeral for a woman who was 102 and a half that I'll do on Saturday. And every time I sit down with families to plan the funeral, it's always a little bit frustrating when it becomes apparent that they have never had these tender conversations, particularly when the individual is well into their senior years. And they're always a little shocked that they're having this conversation. And, you know, even things like, did your mom have a favorite hymn? Any particular scripture that they might want to have read, or anything read? And more often than not, if they have not had those conversations, there's that deer in the headlight look. And so one of the things that I've done is put together a sheet that simply says, here are my funeral wishes. And it provided it for folks, or made it available just when you're prepared to be able to sit down and say, here's what I want. I can assure you that if you're an elderly person, your children will greatly appreciate that, rather than having to guess or just simply turn to their pastor or whoever's doing and say, you pick something, which just seems pretty cold. So thank you for lifting up the notion of tender conversations.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tanya. You hit on a key point, and that's having that conversation. And I had that conversation with my parents, and I plain and simple said, you know, I don't know what to do if you or both of you die. What are your wishes? And my mom says, oh, that's simple. Just cremate me and spread my ashes over Lake Powell. And I go, ooh, okay. And turned to my dad, and he said, that's easy. Just stick me in the ground and move on with your life, but don't you burn me. And after that, my mother turned to me and said, I love you. And those are words that I had never heard in my 56 years of life until 1 year before my dad's death and multiple years before my mom's death. But those sensitive conversations can really elicit a great response, you know.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Oh, and I also was a paramedic, so I know about the CPR stuff.
Yes, my husband is an RN and he does this a lot, but I did it once and it was traumatic.
Yeah. The other thing about the DNR is my dad had a DNR, but he locked it up in a safety deposit box,
Yes.
and I couldn't get access to it. And the hospital, yeah, and not only that, but it was a holiday when he went into when they put him on life support. So you've got to get that information out. But like you said, as a paramedic, you know, I respond, I'm going to start thumping on your chest.
Yep.
And DNR or not, you know.
I mean, is there
So
any way
let it
around
be.
that?
I'm sorry.
As an EMT or whatever, is there any way around that? Because I know today, from the hospital perspective, it's much easier. The systems they've got, and when you come in, especially when you're older, they say, "Do we have your what did you call it again? The document." I think I mentally block it out, but
A DNR or a pulse, depending on what it might be, a pulse. So if you're in the hospital, if you're going to a hospital, it's easier. If you're at your home and you have a form, then it's okay. Like if you have a form to show, but
okay.
if you're, my point was like, if you're on the sidewalk, it doesn't matter. Like there's no, you're kind of at the whim of who shows up. So. Yeah.
So you'd have to carry it around with you or something.
I don't even think that would matter, honestly.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I think that, we went through this with my mom. They did one. I mean, we were really all prepared. She had hospice and, we're a large family though, and lots of siblings, and some of them had to get used to being able to talk to them. So I'm pretty brave. And I usually would say, okay, Mom, you want to talk about this? She'd say she wanted to go home. And I go, oh, well, you are in your home. But if you mean heaven, yeah, we can talk about that. But anyway, so that was kind of a training for the other ones because you get multiple discussions and that is a mess. So we had someone who was in charge of the medical, and then that really makes a difference. However, one time in a hospital, her DNR got overridden, and the medical person, our sister who is a medical person, but she she was really frustrated because they really needed to talk to her, not the sister who was doing the other stuff. It's very interesting though to me to have that organized a little bit because she was really helpful, and I think ended up being helpful to the hospital. And then they finally got on board, and they weren't going to do those, some big test that they wanted to do, or some procedure they did that was not necessary at that point. But it's interesting to have someone who is designated, who gets the medical stuff. I think that was really helpful for our family.
Yeah.
I think Mary Kay raises a really important point. Having things organized, clearly spelled out, and being able to communicate that directly to the hospital staff, because they have all sorts of concerns not to do everything possible. If they don't, then you could have family members that are going to say, well, you could have done much more, and so they're in a catch-22. In our family, my father trained us at a young age. He had a verbal DNR. He said, if you find me on the floor, walk around the block 3 times. If I'm still breathing, then call 911. Because he wanted to be sure that he was either still going to make it or just let him go.
I had a sister who had been in the nursing home for 10 years with MS, and she had not only a DNR, but no tube feeding. And I can't remember the name of the directive, but that's when she finally couldn't swallow. We sat with her for 5 days. And we were really glad that she had signed that because it removed any angst from us.
Absolutely. I think that's really part of this important piece is when somebody can verbalize what their values are at the end of life. that makes it easier, right? To know that you don't want something specific like a tube feeding, but even to know, like, if I can't watch TV, you know, I've read books where people are like, if I can't eat my ice cream and watch TV, then I don't want to be living, right? You know, in the space of like, what extra do you want done? Speaking of what those values are, can really be helpful. Even if you don't know the specifics, if you know that they really value their, you know, independence in one way or the other, we can take that into consideration.
Tanya, could you address the role of music at the time of death? With my mother, I knew she had a favorite hymn, and it was just her and I at the time of her death. And I sang that to her, and it, in spite of, she was very disturbed, but she found peace and seemed to end peacefully
Oh,
through music.
that's lovely, Keith. Thank you for sharing that. Right. So hearing is the last sense to go as we go through dying. At least that's what it appears. And of course, we don't know for sure, but that's what it appears. So very often you will hear people that are talking to their loved ones, and then they'll respond back, even if they haven't been responsive for a couple days. Or in your case, of this lovely, you know, music that definitely kind of ushers in. My grandmother, she had her children around her and they were saying the rosary, and she mouthed the words, you know, to that. And within, you know, an hour, she passed as well. So I think that there must be power there if there are something called threshold singers, people who are willing to come into that space and sing people through. There must be something very, very primal in that. And I think we've seen that in different, at least I've seen that in different ways working with people with dementia. They say, or even Parkinson's, right? That there's something in our brain that connects very, very well with music. So I'm not surprised that in your case that hymn that she really connected with was a lovely connecting space. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, for being a resource in the community and for us today. We really appreciate it. And for those that joined us as additional guests, and Tanya as well, you are always welcome. We meet on Tuesdays and right now over Zoom, so it's a little bit easier.
Great. I will put in the chat my website. I'll be having more resources go up on there as well, but I have a few resources right now. So
Great, thank you.
Just put that on there. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Just a reminder, next week, Kurt's on deck for the program. The 14th, Dave Hardy. 21st, Linda. 28th, Harlan. 7th, Diane. And March 14th, Lynn Hunt. There you go.
And Kurt is hoping to have some of the kids from school join us next week. Dave and Harlan, I see you're on here. If you could let me know when you've got your program finalized, I'll update our website so anybody checking it can get the information.
Thank you, Patty.
Neat to hear, Stephen, that we're all on a first name basis except Lynn Hunt.
Huh?